Hey guys, welcome to That Florida Feeling. I hope everybody's had a good week. I have to say thank you so much. That Florida Feeling just hit 10,000 downloads. I can't believe it. You guys are simply amazing. I'm overwhelmed. I never thought starting this project and this as the podcast would ever get me to 10,000 downloads and plays. I started this just as something to do in an unemployment period during the pandemic, and to be here 3 years later to have this many people actually wanting to listen to me and then to have 10,000 downloads, I am overwhelmed, and you guys are awesome. I know it's all because of you guys, and I know I tell you this every time, but thank you so much. It's overwhelming, and you guys are amazing. So thank you. I really appreciate it. I appreciate every one of you guys sharing the podcast, telling people about the podcast, liking the podcast, giving reviews. And so from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. You guys are awesome. I also want to give a shout out to Unfiltered Studios. I am a part of Unfiltered Studios. There are some amazing people on Unfiltered Studios. If you're looking for a new podcast to go check out Unfiltered Studios. There are some amazing people who put out podcasts daily, weekly, bi-weekly. If you're looking for something new, you can find it. There's sports. There's Stupid History Minute, which I love. It's literally a minute. You get a fact. If you're ever on Jeopardy, might be something you need to listen to. There's really great ones that talk about mental health and uplifting podcasts, history, movies. So definitely check out Unfiltered Studios if you're looking for something new. It's just a great place, and there's some amazing people. I also want to give a shout out to Roger. He gave me the topic that we're going to talk about today. So thank you for that. We'll get to that in just a second. A lot of us do not like bucket hats. As a person who doesn't like bucket hats, I'm glad to hear that. But I am glad that we all think my cat looks adorable in bucket hats. I will have you know that 5 seconds after that picture, it was ripped off and he ran away upset. Can't say I blame him. Not a fan of bucket hats myself. But yeah, if you can rock a bucket hat, go for it. It's just not my thing. But do wear a hat if you're outside in the sun, because skin cancer is totally a thing, and don't do that. Don't get that. Always wear sunscreen. As a person who's had skin cancer, I will always advocate for wear a hat, wear sunscreen. Don't do that to yourself. And if a bucket hat is the last resort, then yeah, I guess we're going to put it on. We're going to complain about it, but we're going to do it. And then one more thing before I get into the topic for today. It's very quiet out of Tampa this week. I just had to say it. That's all I'm going to say. All right, on to the actual topic for this week. Again, thank you, Roger, for suggesting this. I don't know why it just never came to me. But I appreciate the info you shared with me. And we're going to talk about them. We're going to talk about the Calusa today. The Calusa was a group of people who lived on the sandy shores of southwest coast of Florida a very, very long time ago. The Calusa were known as the Shell Indians, and they lived in Florida a long time ago. They kind of started tracing them around 500 BC, and they were really known as the archaic culture, and then kind of the Glades culture. And they know that they were there around that time because they found pottery from this time period. And they found it from the earliest they found was about 3500 BC, and then they found some dating up to 500 AD, and then it lasts until about 1750. And we know this because there is contact with the Spanish, which I'll get into that in a second. The highlight of the Calusa really started about 880, and that's when they really became a society. Now, the actual Calusa is called the Calusa-Hatchie culture. It's a lot to say, so we're really going to call them the Calusa. But the Calusa-Hatchie culture really took off from about 500 AD to 1750 AD. And the territory they really stuck to was Estero Bay to Charlotte Harbor, and then over to Lake Okeechobee. So think of a big triangle, and really considered Charlotte, Lee, and Collier counties. Now, the actual period or area that when you could consider it from Tampa Bay over to probably just the edge of the Glades towards Miami, and then all the way down to the Keys, and then the very bottom of Florida, and then back over to the coast. They technically roamed that whole period, but at their height, it would have been in Charlotte, Lee, and Collier counties. That's where the Calusa-Hatchie culture and the Calusa really dominated. Now, the Calusa culture was really well known for fishing. They really relied on mainly shellfish and fishing as their main way of getting food and nutrients and even trading. They were also known to build culture mounds. And they did this by shells, and you can still find shell mounds. And this is really how they did their hunting and their, well, I say hunting, but fishing. They also used the mangroves and the seagrass in the estuaries, and they did this by constructing their houses up on stilts. Because as we know in the Everglades, and if you don't know a lot about the Everglades, definitely check out it was like 2022, I believe. I did a podcast on the Everglades, and the Everglades is really like a constant moving stream. It's tides, and it's freshwater, and it's saltwater. And so you can't really build on the Everglades. You have to build above it. So they would build their houses by putting on stilts, and it was just a floor, and then they would weave palmetto leaves together, and there was no walls. So if you've ever seen a cheeky hut, think something close to a cheeky hut. And they would build above the Everglades because, like I said, the Everglades are constantly moving. It's a tide. It doesn't really stop. So, yeah, that's how they would build up. They would do that. But then they would also use the extensive network of bays and sounds to move around, to hunt, to trade. And, that's really how they lived. They also did build mounds, of course, to be above it. But 80 to 90% of their life was built around fish and fishing, and really shellfish. Crabs were super important, they found out, to the Calusa people. But they also did hunt. They did rely on white-tailed deer, and then they did also they did hunt ducks, American alligators, turtles. They were even known to hunt manatees and sea urchins. They would also collect plants and wild roots and fruit to supplement their diets. It was really cool. When they did archaeological digs in the mounds and around them to kind of learn about these people, they did find tools. And a lot of the tools were made from wood or bones or shells. They did also find like perforated stones and plummets of limestone. And they believe that the limestone was used to help create the fishing nets, like weights to be able to keep them, when you throw a net to kind of keep them down so that they could actually catch the fish. So that's pretty cool. They also found ceremonial tablets and then other tools, like cutting edge tools and hammers that were made from shells. They also found artifacts as far south as Key Marco, and these were made from stone and limestone, and then they also found palm fibers, which they believe were used for fishing nets. They didn't find a lot of wood artifacts, but they did, and these were mostly like masks and carving of animals, and then toy models and canoes. And canoes would have been very big to this, to the Calusa, as that would have been their main source of moving around. Now, at the height of the Calusa society, they would have had a stratified society. So they would have had commoners and nobles, to put it in like a term that we would think of. There is no evidence that they would have had institutionalized slavery, but they did use captives for work and possibly even sacrifice. They did have it set up where they had a few leaders that would actually govern the tribe, and then they were supported by a labor for the majority of the tribe. And the leaders would include possibly a chief or a king, and then a military leader, maybe a captain or a general, and then a priest. And the captain of the Calusa would, they would basically, the captain, the priest, and the king, chief, they would rule from, the Mound Key, which was like I don't know, their like capital. And it's really cool because there's actually a Mound Key Archaeological State Park. And this is where they believe that their like capital was. And this state park is located in Estero Bay, and that's actually at the mouth of the Estero River. And this is where they believe the most important site of the Calusa tribe was. And their capital was Calusa. Now, this was created over 2,000 years ago. And they did find a lot of archaeological facts here. Like, they did some digs. The reason they believe this site was so important and they picked this site is because it's at the river. This would have been rich in marine life. So this would have been big for food resources. It would have been appealing because they were hunters gatherers. And then because where it sits, it would have been great because as they grew, they could have gotten rid of like food waste or debris or anything. And they built a lot of mounds on this site, and then they even built like canals and water courts, and you can still see them today. You can go to this state park, and you can actually see how the Calusa would have lived at this site. And then when they built these mounds, though, they did so in a certain pattern. They were constructed and organized of a midden, which is they built them by shells and fish and animal bones, and then pottery. So basically trash. They built these mounds, and basically they were islands in the river. And they were created by trash heaps. Like, basically, their trash heaps are these islands. And, like, it's so strange. Because really, it's so strange to describe this. Because, like, when I was writing this out to describe to you guys, I was trying to make it sound so much better than it was. But it's... Because it is a trash heap, but it's not really just a trash heap. Like, the way that they did it, it's built in such a way that it's not just a heap of garbage that they just, like, tossed aside. But they actually did it because, like, as a display of power and monument and burials. So it serves a purpose the way that it's built. And they did so for a reason. And it's done this way so that it could be a ceremonial center for the kingdom. So, like, they didn't just throw trash and create a heap. They, like, the bottom is a certain thing for a reason. And then the next layer is a certain thing for a reason. And then so forth and so on. And then burials and then more stuff. So it's like, it's layered the way it is for the reason that it is. Because it sounds so weird to just say, here, it's their trash. But it's not. They had a method to their madness is about the only way I can describe that. And it, and they did this over many different mounds. So they have a couple different islands, set up for ceremonial and burial and religious reasons. And they do think that these different mounds made up Calusa. And this is also where they think that the king would have hosted like weddings and ceremonies. And they also think, though, that this is where they met the Spanish. This is where they think that the Calusa met the Spanish, and then the Spanish later, and I'll get to this further on, but they also think that this is also where the Spanish made an alliance through a marriage with the Calusa. And I mean, the Calusa had a huge, massive area. I mean, it spanned from just south of Tampa Bay, technically, all the way to the 10,000 Islands, which is at the very bottom of Marco Island, all the way over to Lake Okeechobee, and then it went as far down towards Miami. So, I mean, you're talking about a massive, massive area that this would have been over just for these people. And if you want to see it, like I said, you can go to Mound Key Archaeological State Park to see what their capital would have looked like. And I'll talk more about Mound Key in just a second, but I did need to mention it in this spot. Now, they did have a couple different, the only written record about this is from the Spanish, unfortunately. And I'll talk about them when I get to the Spanish meeting them. Now, the Calusa really did do, of course, their diet really mainly consisted of fish, because they did live along the coast and estuaries through the Everglades. And they think, though, that in particular pinfish and pigfish were their main source of food. And that's because these are smaller fish, easier to catch. And, of course, they did supplement by eating sharks and rays, of course, crustaceans, ducks, and other land animals when they could catch them. And the reason that they believe that, and again, this is a note from the Spanish, because Pedro Menendez de Avilés actually visited the Calusa in 1566, and the Calusa only served him fish and oysters. And so that's also why they kind of believe that, you know, their diet mainly came from the fish and the shellfish, because when they also dug up the sites, there's not a ton of bones from mammals. And less than 1% of those bones were birds or reptiles. So that's kind of why they think that they mainly did shellfish or fish. And they said that less than any of it was that they actually cultivated maize. So they weren't very agriculturally dependent at all. Now, as far as tools go for the Calusa, they really mostly caught their fish with nets. And like I said, for the tools, they did have nets woven with the palm fibers. They do believe that they used the rocks or the bones to weight them down. And of course, they would have used the bones and shells gauges to actually weave the nets, much like you would crochet something. And of course, they did have, like anytime you go fishing, you have a bobber and a sinker, and they would have used something much the same to actually weigh the net down and be able to actually get the fish. They also used spears and hooks to catch fish. They actually found well-preserved nets and floats and hooks on Key Marco. And so that was a pretty cool find, just to be able to see how these people would have actually lived and been able to do everyday life. Mollusk shells and wood were also used to make the hammering and tools, but they've also found some really cool carvings in the archaeological finds. Shark's teeth were also used for grading and cutting and carving and engraving. They also used palm fiber to make cords. They used a lot of cabbage palm leaves. They were known to use the palmetto trunks for their wood, and then Spanish moss and sisal to make either cords or other things for their nets. The Calusa also made fish traps and fish corrals, which would be like a pen, from wood and cord. Artifacts of wood have also been found to include bowls, ear ornaments, I'm assuming like earrings, mask, plaques, and a finely carved deer head. So, I mean, and there's a really cool carving of an alligator head that I'll post on Instagram that actually looks really cool. There's some amazing artists apparently in the Calusa tribe. And then, of course, they found other plaques and objects that were painted, which were more of an ornamental or religious standard. There has to date not been a canoe, like a full dugout canoe, found for the Calusa, which would have been how they would have, moved around, especially through the Everglades. They think that they would have used cypress or pine to have made their canoes. Now, of course, the process of shaping a boat was achieved by burning out the middle and then chopping to remove the charred center, and then using shells as tools to actually remove this center. The only time a canoe really has been found, though, was during an excavation for a middle school in Marathon, Florida, and that was in 1954. That was not the Calusa. They thought it was the Calusa, but there's no proof that it was. But that's the only time a dugout canoe has ever actually been found. So, that's kind of cool. But there's no proof that it actually was them. Now, the Calusa, like I said, they lived in the houses that were up off of the ground. They actually had a lot of communal houses as opposed to everybody having their own house. The only really thing we have about the housing was, again, from Pedro Menendez de Avilés when he visited the capital in 1566. He described the chief's house as large enough to hold 2,000 people without crowding, and it also served as the council house. When the chief formally received Menendez into his house, he sat on a raised seat surrounded by 500 of his principal men. His sister wife sat on another raised seat surrounded by 500 women. And the chief's house was described as having 2 big windows that suggested it had walls, whereas other housing nearby did not. So, who knows? 5 friars that also stayed in the chief's house later on towards the 1700s complained that the roof let in rain, sun, and dew. So, again, that's where the woven palmetto leaves would have come into play. So, it sounds like they were not obviously the greatest houses, but also probably coming from Spain and seeing earthen houses, they probably would have complained anyways. There's another report from the Spanish later on, again, almost towards the 1700s, that the Spanish only noted that there were only 16 houses in the Calusa capital of Calos, which housed about 1,000 residents. So, different reports. So, what did the Calusa wear? Well, apparently not a lot. The Calusa wore minimal clothing. The men wore deer-skinned breechcloths, which is basically a loincloth. That's about it. The Spanish left less descriptions about the women's attire. So, who knows? But apparently most indigenous women in Florida wore skirts made of Spanish moss. The Calusa painted their bodies on a regular basis, but did not tattoo themselves. The men were known to have long hair. So, I don't know. I guess that's like a normal thing. Yeah, they were supposed to be fierce, warlike people with long hair. That's the description that the Spanish wrote, and they were supposed to be not that friendly. I don't really know. I mean, if you were coming into my territory, I probably wouldn't be very friendly to you. I don't know. The missionaries left descriptions that they would have a Calusa man cut his hair upon converting to Christianity, and it would be a great sacrifice to the Calusa man. They didn't say that they wore a lot of jewelry or other ornamentation. Now, during the Menendez de Avilés visit in 1566, the chief's wife was described as wearing pearls and precious stones with gold beads around her neck. And the heir of the chief wore a gold ornament on his forehead and beads on his legs. Now, ceremonial or other artistic masks have been discovered that have dated back prior to when the Spanish got there. Some of the masks even have moving parts that uses pull strings and hinges so that the person could alter the look of the mask while wearing it, which is kind of cool. And there is a drawing of a mask excavated at Key Marco that could be made by the Calusa. So, kind of cool. So, what did the Calusa believe prior to the Spanish? Well, they believed that 3 supernatural beings ruled the world, and that all people had 3 souls, and that the souls migrated into animals after death. The most powerful ruler governed the physical world. The second most powerful ruler governed human governments, and the last helped in wars, choosing which side would win. The Calusa believed that the 3 souls were in the pupil of the human's eye, his shadow, and his reflection. The soul in the eye's pupil stayed with the body after death, and the Calusa would consult with that soul at the graveside. The other 2 souls left after death and entered an animal. If the Calusa killed such an animal, the soul would migrate to a lesser animal and would eventually be reduced to nothing. So you could eventually kill part of someone's soul. Calusa ceremonies included processions of priests and singing women, and the priests would wear carved masks, which at other times were hung on walls inside temples. Hernando de Escalante Fontaneda, who was an earlier chronicle of the Calusa, described as sorcerers in the shape of a devil with horns on their heads, who ran through town yelling like animals for 3 or 4 months at a time. So he didn't have a good time. The Calusa actually remained committed to their belief systems despite the Spanish attempt to convert them to Catholicism. The nobles in the Calusa remained committed and resisted conversion in part because their power and position were ultimately tied into their belief system, and they were intermediaries between the gods and the people. Okay, that makes sense. Conversion would have destroyed the source of their authority, authenticity, and legitimacy in the tribe. The Calusa resisted physical encroachment and spiritual conversion by the Spanish and their missionaries for almost 200 years, suffering decimation only by disease. And the tribe was ultimately destroyed by the Creek and Yamasee raiders in the early 18th century. Evidence shows that the Calusa buried their departed in those mounds, and after death they were placed in a charnel house, or a vault or a building where the human skeletal remains are stored. They're often built near churches for depositing bones that are unearthed while digging graves. Okay, that's what a charnel house is. I didn't know that. And then they would basically let the flesh fall away naturally, or in some cases, a medicine man with long fingernails would scrape the flesh from the bones. I never want that job. That is just nasty. Okay, sorry. Afterwards, the bones would be gathered up, placed in a basket, and buried in a mound. These mounds were both for burial and religious ceremonies, and they would gather on top of them on holy days to sacrifice plants and honey. Got it. Okay. So they did have their own language. It's an unclassified language, but they did actually have their own language. All right. They were considered, again, to be shell collectors. Again, the shells you can see in the huge heaps. They did use shells for everyday use, for tools, utensils, jewelry, and ornaments. That's how they got the name the Shell Indians. They were also known to be sailors, as the Caloosahatchee River, which means the River of the Calusa, used to be their main waterway. They did use dugout canoes, like I said, which they, again, could have been cypress or pine, approximate to be 15 feet long. And they believe that they might have even used these to travel as far as Cuba, so they could have been seafaring, which is actually kind of cool. Explorers even reported that the Calusa attacked their ships that were anchored close to shore. They were also known to sail up and down the west coast, salvaging wealth from shipwrecks. Dang, that's actually kind of cool. So when did the Spanish actually contact the Calusa? Well, the first recorded contact between the Spanish and the Calusa was in 1513. And that is actually by none other than Juan Ponce de Leon. He landed on the west coast of Florida, probably at the mouth of the Caloosahatchee River. And that was after his earlier discovery in Florida in April. The Calusa knew of the Spanish before the landing, however, as they had taken in Native American refugees from the Spanish subjugation of Cuba. The Spanish had already careened one of their ships off the coast, and the Calusa had offered to trade with them. Now, after 10 days, a man who spoke Spanish approached Ponce de Leon's ships with a request to wait for the arrival of the Calusa chief. After that, 20 war canoes attacked the Spanish, who drove off the Calusa, killing and capturing them. The next day, 80 shielded canoes attacked the Spanish ships, but the battle was inconclusive. That, though, did, however, make the Spanish want to leave, and they left. So that was in 1513. In 1517, Francisco Hernandez de Cordoba landed in southwest Florida on his return voyage from the Yucatan. He was also attacked by the Calusa. In 1521, Ponce de Leon tried again, and the Calusa drove him out, mortally wounding Ponce de Leon that time, actually. In 1528, part of the Panfilo de Narvaez expedition, Hernando de Soto expedition in 1539 both actually landed in the vicinity of Tampa Bay, north of the Calusa. Did not have any success. Dominican missionaries actually reached the Calusa domain in 1549, but were met with extreme hostility and withdrew. The salvage goods and survivors from the wrecked Spanish ship reached the Calusa in the 1540s and 50s. That was not a good trip as well. The best information, though, about the Calusa comes from the memoir of Hernando de Escalante Fontanita. One of those survivors, Fontanita, was shipwrecked on the east coast of Florida, probably the Florida Keys, in 1550. He was 13 at the time. Although many of the other shipwrecks survived, only Fontanita was spared by the tribe in the territory because he was not an adult. Fontanita lived with various tribes in southern Florida for the next 17 years before being found by the Menendez de Avilés expedition. He, however, gathered the most information. Now, in 1566, Pedro Menendez de Avilés, the same one who founded St. Augustine and ran off Ribault from Jacksonville, actually made true contact with the Calusa. He made an uneasy peace with them because he married the king's sister. That was the marriage I was talking about. Menendez married the king's sister, and she got baptized and took the name Doña Antonia at the conversion. She was converted to Catholicism at the capital and gave him the name Doña Antonia and was given to Menendez, basically. Menendez left a garrison of soldiers and a Jesuit missionary at the Calusa capital. It did not help because hostilities erupted and the Spanish killed the king and his successor and several of the nobles before they just ran away. So basically, the king and everybody else kind of got killed, and his sister was stuck with the Spanish. So about 100 years after the Avilés adventure, there was really small, like next to no contact between the Spanish and the Calusa. The Spanish stayed in northeast Florida. The Calusa stayed in southwest Florida. The Spanish finally re-entered the area in about 1614, and they attacked the Calusa and the Spanish allied there was war between the Calusa and the Spanish allied tribes around Tampa Bay. The Spanish attacked the Calusa as part of this, and a Spanish expedition to ransom some of the captives held by the Calusa in 1680 was forced to turn back. Neighboring tribes refused to guide the Spanish because it's Florida and the Spanish had never been through that part. And the Spanish kind of got stuck because everybody was afraid of the Calusa because they were apparently a feared tribe. So in 1697, the Franciscan missionaries decided to give it a go. So they established a mission to the Calusa but left after only a few months because these people are still very, very hostile. So after an outbreak of war between Spain and England in 1702, slave raids by the Creek and the Yamasee Indians allied with the Province of Carolina, which would have been Great Britain at the time, out of North America, began raiding as far down the Florida Peninsula. The Carolinian colonists, that just sounds weird to say, Carolinian colonists supplied firearms to the Creek and Yamasee, but not the Calusa, because the Calusa were still apparently being mean. So the Calusa and the Creek the Creek and the Yamasee turned on the Calusa, and the Calusa, who had already been ravaged by disease, thanks to the Europeans, pretty much just died out. They tried to retreat into the Everglades, but they were dying out at a rapid pace. In 1711, the Spanish helped evacuate 270 Indians, including what was really left of the Calusa, from the Florida Keys to Cuba, where about 200 actually died. There was they said there was about 1,500 left behind. That's an approximate amount. They don't really know if there was actually that many. The Spanish eventually founded a mission in Biscayne Bay in 1743 to serve the survivors from several tribes, including what was left of the Calusa, who had gathered there and in the Florida Keys. That mission didn't last very long. After Spain seceded Florida to Great Britain in 1763, the remaining tribes of South Florida were relocated to Cuba by the Spanish. That pretty much took them out of the region, and a few Calusas stayed in Florida, and they became what was known into the Seminoles. There's no actual documentation supports that, but if you listen to any of my episodes on the Seminoles, you know that anybody that fought the tribes pretty much ended up being absorbed into the Seminoles. So this is not surprising that anybody left in the Calusa that didn't leave probably did end up in the Seminole tribes. They also think that some of the Calusa might have gone into the Cuban fish camps that were operated in southwest Florida along the 1700s. Some of the Spanish Indians also might have been descendant from the Calusa as well. So, honestly, most of the Calusa might be in Cuba. Whatever's left of them, unfortunately, might be in Cuba. Or ended up in the Seminole tribes, thanks to the fact that most of them were taken out by disease because of the Spanish, which doesn't surprise anybody that lives in Florida and knows anything in Florida history. But we haven't forgotten the Calusa. I told you about Mound Key Archaeological State Park a minute ago, and that's really where they think the capital of Calusa was. And let me tell you about the actual state park. So I mentioned it a little bit, and it really tells about their mounds and their shells and their trash heaps, which I kind of explained they were trash heaps, but they're not trash heaps. They were done that way for a reason. And so, the actual park itself was really a homestead. So it actually started as a homestead. Frank Johnson and his wife, Grandma Johnson, that's actually her name. Okay, yeah, I wrote that, and then I'm like, wait a minute. Yeah, that's actually her name. So Frank Johnson and his wife, Grandma Johnson, were given a homestead on Mound Key in 1891. And this really started the period of European immigration into the former Calusa capital, or that part of Florida. Grandma Johnson remained at Mound Key and really allowed several other families to build a home on this island, and that's, I didn't write them down, but I believe it was 4 families. And when she was there, she taught them to fish and farm and build homes and stay cool in the summer and protect them against Florida's abusive sun and hurricanes and storms. And by the turn of the 20th century, a lot of the Mound Key settlers had kind of moved upriver to Estero and really started that area into like a citrus and cow farming area, because Estero was more of an agricultural town when it very first kind of got founded. And so the Johnsons really sold the island to the Crescians, which was a utopian cult, in 1905. So they did keep the Mound Key for, 14 years, it looks like. But in that time, the Crescians, I'm probably not saying that right, I don't really remember how to say it, but there's a utopian cult that kind of came to that area. So in 1894, the Crescians came to that area, and it's what it is it's a scientific religious belief system came to the area, and they built a community based on their utopian ideas. And it grew pretty quickly over the next 2 decades. And during that time, part of the property that they acquired was on Mound Key. And they stayed in the area. And after the death of their leader, Cyrus Teed, in 1908, their numbers really declined because everybody was there to hear Cyrus and they wanted to know his ways. And so they kept the land. And in 1961, the remaining Crescians decided to give over ownership of the key as well as other land to nearby Estero, which was the town, or in the town nearby Estero, to the state. They gave it to the state of Florida, and they wanted to use it to form a park. And they did, and that was the Crescent State Historic Park, or Historic Site, sorry. And 9 acres remained privately owned by the McGee family, and the McGee family agreed to sell the parcel to Lee family in 2019. And in 2020, the archaeologist confirmed that Mound Key was the site of Fort San Antonio de Carlos, which I'll tell you what that is in a second. And that was really the Spanish fort, as well as one of the first Jesuit sites in North America. But today, it is Mound Key Archaeological Site. And that is where they believe Calusa was, and that is where the Calusa tribe's headquarters were, where their culture grew out of, and where they really, thrived and had their culture. And it's a really cool state park. And there's a lot to do there. And you can go boating, fishing. There's a ton of wildlife viewing there. There's an interpretive exhibit. It tells about the mounds. There's nature trails and information kiosk that are kind of going there now. It is kind of a primitive park. It's still a growing park. It's still kind of new compared to other state parks, so there's no bathroom facilities there. It is an island, though, so you can only go by boat. Okay? Because it is an island, you can only get there by boat. So just keep that in mind. You're not just going to walk up to it. It is in Estero Bay, because these were people who traveled by canoes. It's not surprising that their capital was on an island. And it is only a few miles by boat from Koreshian Historic Site or Lovers Key Carl E. Johnson State Park. But you will have to get there by boat. Now, if you do go, be sure to check out the mound, but also look, since it is the site of San Antonio de Carlos, that is the Jesuit mission in the New World. That was the one that was founded when Avilés came and, really made contact with the Calusa and, built a fort, and that was the Jesuit mission. And, when they killed everybody. It's the nicest way to put it. That's when they killed everybody. Because there was a problem. They just didn't like each other. So, yeah, it was King Carlos, known as Carlos. That's the Spanish version. They took Carlos and called him Carlos because they just can't, got to turn everything Spanish. And honestly, at that time when they built this, there was probably 20,000 Calusa people in southwest Florida. So, yeah, it's a really interesting site. If you have a boat and you want to go to Mount Key, I definitely recommend checking it out, because it really does show you, how the Calusa people lived. It is an interesting group of people. That really was, the way of Florida, in literally old Florida, in the 15, 16, and 1700s. We talk about the Timucuan, and we've talked about the Cherokee, the Cherokee were part of Florida. And then we've talked about the Seminole, and we've talked about the Creek, and but we've never really talked about the Calusa, because I feel like it's a forgotten tribe. And so thank you to Roger for reminding me that there is another tribe out there. And they did live in Southwest Florida, and, they were really kind of more of a seafaring people, and they lived off of the fish and spoke their own language, and they weren't nice to the Spanish. They didn't convert to Catholicism, and they didn't let them take their land. And I think that was, pretty cool of them, that they just didn't, they wanted to be left alone and live their own life. So I think that's great. It sucks that they died out because of the disease brought by the Spanish, but, that's kind of like the forgotten tribe, I guess, of Florida to me, is the Calusa Indians. So yeah, thank you to Roger for reminding me about them and then giving me the chance to actually research them. I didn't realize how much there actually was on them. Because when you do research Native Americans in Florida, you do have a ton on a lot of the other tribes. Like I said, the Timucuan and the Seminole and the Creeks and, Muskogee and everything else. And, the Calusa, there are people out there studying the Calusa. And there's still a lot of people, studying about them and learning about them. And there's still a lot to learn about them. And so it's really interesting. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to be able to look into this tribe and talk about them. I hope you enjoyed learning something about Florida history today. A lot of things I couldn't really say, and some of this really was hard to explain. It really is hard to explain to you guys. Well, they made trash heaps, so if some of that sounded a little strange, I am sorry. But I do hope you guys enjoyed learning about it. If you do have any suggestions, please tell me. I love hearing from you guys. I love being able to hear your suggestions, because sometimes it's stuff that I wouldn't have thought of. And I'll be honest with you, this is one that I wouldn't have thought of. So thank you for that. No Florida man today. anytime I talk about the Spanish, I feel their own version of Florida man. So there's that. Reach out though, say hi, share those memes. If you have a second, please, please, please tell others about the podcast. Give a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify. It just helps get the podcast out there. I really appreciate it, you guys. I hope everybody has a great week. Don't forget to drink your water, wear your sunscreen, be nice to one another. And as always, guys, that's your daily dose of sunshine.
This podcast is a production of Unfiltered Studios. If you would like to know more about joining Unfiltered Studios, please visit our website at unfpod.com for more information.